Hello! Another writing video by me, Hayden. I am not having my snake because I think he was kind of distracting me last time, as sweet as he is. So, it's just me today. Lenka had a suggestion. She wanted to know how I make myself stop going back and editing or start a draft over while I'm writing it. Usually first drafts, I think she was asking. And then she wanted to know how to pick from contradicting but equally interesting ideas for a storyline or a character development. So I'm going to start with the first part of that question. How I stop myself from going back and editing if I start a novel and realize that I could do better. I actually just keep going. I had to teach myself this pretty early on in my writing career because I was notorious for doing this. In Shadow of Fate Book 1, I was obsessed with continuing to rewrite the first 150 pages for probably 6 years. I started Shadow of Fate when I was 9, and I didn't finish a first draft finish from beginning to end, first draft of book 1 until I was 15 or 16. This was not from inexperience because I wrote all the time. I finished other books, but for this, I finished other books like handwritten, books that weren't as dear to me, but for Shadow of Fate, I kept getting stuck. Or I would just think, oh, well, I can do so much better now. So I would change an idea. Longler's age would change. He used to be older than Kanari, and I believe older than Nikon even, who was like 2,769, I think, years old. So I would change these ideas and then be like, oh no, now I have to write the whole thing. A way that I stop myself from doing this is going, well, that's nice. That's an idea. I need to keep going anyway. Because otherwise I wouldn't get my draft done. My main goal now when I write is to get the draft out. With a version, which is my angel story, I've been struggling with this because I don't have a good foothold in the world, and it's harder to write the world if you don't have a good foothold in it. And I do keep restarting it the first couple of chapters. Beginnings are the hardest things for me to write. My stories always come to me ending first. I know how everyone ends up. I don't know how they start or how they get there. So my struggle is to try to figure out that beginning, and that's where my drafting problem lies. Usually a way around this is to remember that you can't you can write your book however you want. You can write middle, end, beginning, end, middle, beginning, however you want. But for me, I can't finish a draft unless I write it from beginning to end. Scenes may come to me out of order, and I might add them back in later if I write a scene. I'm like, oh, I can shove that back in here, or what have you. But unless I keep in mind that I can't begin an editing process unless I have a draft to begin with, and I can't finish a book unless I keep going. So even if better ideas present themselves, I usually write them off to the side as like an alternate, like, oh, this could go here when I'm hacking it apart. Versus, oh, I need to start over so that I can get to this point B instead of this other point B, which both ideas are awesome for the story, but which one do I feel like doing? I just think it's super important to remember that when you write, you can't, again, when you're, the point of a first draft, at least for me, is that you're trying to hammer out a skeleton. And after that, when you write drafts, when you redraft it and rework it, you're adding on the meat, and you're making things make sense. You're making joints move, plot points connect, and you can't do that if you don't have the bones. So the first draft is the bones. It's the barest beginning of your idea. And for me, in my books, I learned to be merciless with my own writing. I hack probably 70% of my first draft. Whatever I write, I hack it out and replace it with new material when I re-edit, when I go back and do draft 2. With Weightless and Sabotage, the last 2 books of the Crossfire series, I probably replaced, around 75% of the story. The story might have been the same, but the writing, the scenes, I completely changed it. And I had to take out a lot of scenes that I liked, but they didn't fit as well as they had in the draft before I made the changes. So I think that a way to how to make yourself going back and re-editing while you're writing is to remember that first drafts aren't supposed to be perfect. And new ideas are great, but you can also write them both. You can write a new scene or keep track of your new ideas and keep track of problems that you have with your story as you're writing it and kind of push past them, because you're going to make mistakes. That's the hard thing about writing. You're going to make crazy mistakes. I made crazy, stupid mistakes. In the first version of Crossfire, there were 2 scenes that drove Amanda nuts because they were almost the exact same conversation in the exact same place with the exact same 3 characters, just like a week apart or something crazy like that. And I had to hack one of them and condense it into one conversation and then push past the story where the second conversation happened, or change the conversation completely. So I think it's just important to remember that you need to get the story out. And you could always go back and rehack it. And that doesn't mean the first draft is useless. I don't regret ever spending time writing the first drafts of Shadow of Fate or the first drafts of Crossfire or the first draft of a version. Like right now, I know it stinks. But my goal is not to make sure right now that it doesn't stink. It's to work toward the end goal, which is continue to redrafting and polishing it. Like you're trying to create a marble statue and you're chiseling away at that marble and you're not going to just crack it and then bam, there's David. You have to keep going and going and polishing and chiseling away. And you can't do that if you don't pick up the chisel. You can't do that if you don't start, if you don't push and keep going. So that's usually how I do it, is I continuously remind myself that it doesn't have to be perfect the first time, that I'm going to change it. And doesn't mean that I don't put my full effort into it, because I always put my full effort into my writing, but it means that there's room for improvement. To me, my style is always going to change from beginning to end. What is in the beginning is going to be different than what is in the end, which is why I kept rewriting Crossfire, and I've been rewriting Weightless and Sabotage, because the characters have changed. What I knew to be true in the beginning isn't true by the end. For instance, I never knew that Jamal was gay. Never came up. And then all of a sudden, it's not necessarily a focal point of the storyline, but it's part of him and Rook, obviously. So I had to work that in and change a couple of things of how he presented himself and that type of stuff. Not because that was the only thing that defined him, because it was one of the things that did define him. I didn't know he cooked either. So in the beginning, they kind of just always ate takeout, or they all cooked. And Jamal was like, no, I'm the one who cooks. So I had to go back and add scenes that showed that and reflected that. And but again, I couldn't have gotten to that point unless I kept writing and got to know the characters and got to know the world and got to know the story. When I come up with new books, I kind of think of them like people. Like, I'm not going to jump to personal questions when I first meet people. Instead, I'm going to, you have to kind of ease into it. You have to kind of ease into the relationship. And when you start your book, that's what you're doing. You're easing into a relationship with the story and the writing and the characters, even if you know them for forever. I knew Rook for a year before I put him in Crossfire, and even then he surprised me. He had a completely different spin in Crossfire, and I had to adjust the story to that. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And then as for the second part of the question, is how to pick from contradicting but equally interesting ideas for storylines and character development would kind of be the same thing, where write what fits first and keep alternate ideas to the side. Keep a file, keep notes, put sticky notes all over if you have a hard copy, or just I have a separate file, like when I'm in Scrivener, when you can create like the chapters, I always have one that just says ideas, and they may not be ideas that I always use, but or I will use, but they're just ideas of where things will go. with a version, I've only gotten like 3 chapters in, and like 5,000 things have changed already. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's going to be a little different. The viewpoint change. I went from first person to third person suddenly. A lot changed. So I think it's whatever best suits your story. And with drafts, when you change from draft to draft, different things will suit your story. So it's not that you can't pursue both, because you can. So I would say just keep things in mind, and whatever gets you to move forward, pick that at the moment, and then make sense of it later, because you can't look back at something unless you have it to begin with. So I think that would be ideal. A lot changed with my characters in Crossfire. Ideas that I had, Cindy became not as prickly as I originally intended, and which was good because it helped her with other characters. I never would have thought that she would be best friends with someone like Rook. Like, they're complete opposites. And in the beginning, she would never have tolerated him and his quietness and his sullenness and how serious he is all the time. She would have been like freaked out by it and put off by it. But things change, and characters change, and people change. And the best thing I can say is just treat it like a relationship, and know that you have to go from beginning to end, and to keep alternate things in mind, and don't be afraid to cut things. And first drafts are not useless. They are your foundation, and you can change it, but you can't build a house without a foundation, in my opinion, how I write. So that's my answer. All right, love ya.